Before I get into the text of Hosea chapter 7, I want to just call your attention to an email that I got the other day. And this is a positive email thanking us for our website. This is a person that I sent some DVDs to that came across our website and requested the DVDs that we offer on there. They say, again, thank you so much for your website. I'm telling everyone I come in contact with about it and about GBN, which is the Gospel Broadcasting Network that we link to on our website. And he goes on to say, I did not know anything about it. I now get up in the morning and listen to it all day while I'm in the house. So this is a person that was not aware of the brethren and the good work that they're doing with the Gospel Broadcasting Network. And so out of the emails that I get, some of which I cannot read in public, and others that are rather harsh to say the least, there's every once in a while we get a good positive one from the brethren. And we are getting contacts on our website, roysecitycoc.org, from all over the world, sending DVDs out left and right to different places, India, Australia, several in Australia. Just throughout the world, we've gotten requests. So it is a shining light in the world, and so that's a good way of contacting people, a good method of reaching people that we, under normal circumstances, probably could not ever reach just in physical contact. Hosea chapter 7, verse 11, we're talking about the prophet Hosea speaking to Israel and to Judah for their sins, preaching to them about their sins and their attitude. He says in verse 11, this is about where we left off last week, Ephraim is like a dove, silly and without sense, calling to Egypt and going to Assyria. And as they go, I will spread over them my net, and I will bring them down like the birds of heavens. I will discipline them according to the report made to their congregation. Woe to them, for they have strayed from me. Destruction to them, for they have rebelled against me. I would redeem them, but they speak lies against me. So you see here that God, through the prophet Hosea, is talking to His people, and He says it's like a dove, silly and without sense. It's like a dove that is flighty. It's like a dove that is going about to and fro, calling to Egypt and going to Assyria. And oftentimes you find that through Israelite history, that when they would get threatened by a foreign power, instead of trusting in God, they would trust in their political alliances. And that's what they are doing. They're calling to Egypt and going to Assyria for help. Not only that, they're going to them for religious advice, unfortunately. And therefore, that's why they're involved in all kind of idolatry and false religion. And he says there in verse 13, woe to them, for they have strayed from me. And we're warned throughout the Bible of the danger of straying away. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1 in the New Testament. Hebrews 2 and verse 1 tells the people of God today, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. So there is the possibility of drifting away or straying away as Israel of old did. And we've got to give the more earnest heed. That means to pay close attention. You've got to pay attention to what you are doing. It's like driving a vehicle. If you don't pay attention to what you're doing, you could be all over the road. If you've done what I have done, you're looking at something over here, and then you find yourself going that direction. That's because you're not focused. And that can be dangerous. You could run off the road. You could hit a car on the side of the road. So not paying attention, not looking ahead, not being very careful in what you're doing could lead to all sorts of disaster. And that's certainly true in the spiritual realm. if we don't have our focus where it should be, if we're looking to the world like Israel was, looking to Egypt and looking to Assyria, we're going to find ourselves rebelling against God. The whole time we think we're serving God. So many congregations find themselves in that condition. They think they're serving God, but in essence they're rebelling against God because they're worldly in their conduct. Any comments about this before we go any further? Verse 14. They do not cry to me from the heart, but they wail upon their beds for grain and wine. They gash themselves. They rebel against me. Although I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. They return, but not upward. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. Now notice it says there in verse 14, they do not cry to me from their heart. They don't cry to me from their heart, but they wail on their beds. And notice there it says, for grain and for wine, they gash themselves, they rebel against me. Is that not like what you find in, I think it's 2 Kings 18, where Mount Carmel, you have Elijah with the prophets of Baal, and the challenge is given. You call upon Baal and see if he will send forth fire to consume this sacrifice. You do that, prophets of Baal, and Elijah said, I'll call upon the God of Israel. I'll call upon Yahweh. And they were going through all their ceremony, and they were gashing themselves, cutting themselves. Was it 1 Kings? 1 Kings, thank you. 1 Kings 18, where that's found. And so they're going through the process of gashing themselves on the arm. And it's part of a pagan ritual to get the attention of your deity. And you'll even see this even today. You'll see, it's called mutilation, in which they actually cut themselves. In some religions, you'll see that. Even in South America, in some of the bizarre Catholic rituals that go on down there that's not very, very common here in the States, they'll parade through the streets with a whip, whipping their back till it's bloody as a sign of penance towards God, as a sign of contrition towards God, as if God wants us to do that. I mean, God doesn't ask us to cut upon ourselves or anything of that nature. But that's how pagan religions involve themselves in wickedness. They gash themselves and they involved in rebellion against me. God warned the people before they went in the land, you don't act like that. You don't act like they act. He tells them also, you don't behave in the manner that they behave themselves. In the Old Testament, He forbade them to get tattoos like the people did. I think there's a principle there for us today in the New Testament for us to think about that when we consider the works of the flesh up against the fruit of the Spirit. Where would tattoos fall? I don't think it's a fruit of the Spirit. I do believe it is a work of the flesh. And I think it falls into that category very easily, Galatians chapter 5. The whole point is this: you don't be like the world. That's what the world does. The world engages in that kind of activity. And therefore, you're to be holy. You're to be someone that is devoted to God. And they were involved in all kind of weird, bizarre rituals. Verse 15, although I trained them and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. I've trained them, I've taught them, I've strengthened them, but they are devising evil against me. They return, verse 16, but not upward. They don't return, some translations say, to the Most High. They get religious, they're calling upon their deities, as we're going to see in chapter 8, but they're not calling upon the Most High. They're not calling upon God, the true God. And so there you have the issue of they're wanting blessings, but they're not willing to live in harmony with God's will to get the blessings. Verse 16, that their princes shall fall by the sword because of their insolence of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. Any questions about chapter 7 or comments before we get into chapter 8? Chapter 8 and verse 1, set the trumpet to your lips, one like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and they rebelled against my law. To me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel has spurned the good, the enemy shall pursue him. Now notice what he's saying here. There's one, this translation says in English Standard Version, a vulture is over the house of the Lord. The other translations say eagle. It's usually in the Hebrew, it's referring to a vulture, and eagles are not only birds of prey, but they eat carrion as well. They eat dead bodies as well. And so it's the imagery there, and I think that's why the English Standard Version here has vulture. Vultures are there where there's death. And that's what's being depicted here. Israel is spiritually dead. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord. That would be the temple. That would be the temple itself. Of course, that would be in Jerusalem, in Judah, the southern kingdom. But he's making it very clear here that even though it was God's house, it's dead. There's a vulture over the house of the Lord because they have transgressed my covenant and they rebelled against my law. That's why they're dead. They might be physically alive. In fact, Amos said that they got a lot of prosperity. I mean, physical prosperity. They got ivory couches and they have a lot of prosperity. But it's deceiving them. It's causing them to think that they are right with God, and I think that is the problem that we find in our society as well. Prosperity does not equal a right relationship with God. Now, in some cases it can, but that's not a gauge always to see whether we're right with God or not. Verse 2, to me they cry, my God, we, Israel, know you. Now notice that. They're crying to God, we know you. Israel has spurned the good. Verse 3, the enemy shall pursue them. We know you, they're saying. And that reminds me of a passage very clearly set forth in the New Testament. John chapter 2. It's not enough just to say we know God. It's not enough to say we know God. We have to keep His commandments. 1 John chapter 2, look at verse 3. Now by this we know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. He who says, I know Him, that's what Israel was saying, and does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps His word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in Him. I've asked several people in religious discussions, we're talking about the Bible, they don't agree with what the Bible plan of salvation is, and they think they're saved, but according to the Bible they're not. And I asked them, how do you know that you know Jesus? And almost always the answer is they can feel. They can feel Him in their heart. They just know they're right. And they never come to this verse because they never connect the dots that knowing that you know Him means you keep His commandments. You do what He says. This is how we know that we know Him, if we keep His commandments. And whoever says, I know Him and does not keep His commandments is a liar. So that's the problem with Israel in Hosea chapter 2 and verse 8. 8 and verse 2. In Hosea 8 and verse 2, they are crying out, my God, we Israel know you. We know you. But no, they don't, because of verse 1, they have transgressed my covenant and they rebel against my law. So talk is cheap the actions prove whether we really know Him or not. And that will cause our speech to be what it ought to be. It's not enough just to say, I know Him. We have to be obedient to His will. By that we prove that we really know Him. And then when we say we know Him, we will be telling the truth. Therefore, that's the proper answer. How do you know that you know Him? How do you know that you're in a right relationship with God? Well, the answer is you keep His commandments. That's the biblical answer. And so many people don't know that that is the right answer. They think it's a relationship. They say relationship, not commandments, relationship. But you can't have a relationship without the commandments. I don't doubt it's a relationship, but it's based upon His will and believing and doing what He says. Look at verse 4 of Hosea chapter 8. They made kings, but but not through me. They set up princes, but I knew it not. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. I have spurned the calf of your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? For it is from Israel a craftsman made it. It is not from God. The calf of Samaria shall be broken in pieces. What's this calf they keep talking about? Idol. The calf that was set up and Dan and Bethel. Remember Jeroboam, when the kingdom split, he set up two sanctuaries, one in Dan and Bethel, said it's not convenient for you to go down to Jerusalem because of you. He knew that if they went down there and started going back to Jerusalem for the God's ordained worship, that would consolidate the nation and he would lose the northern kingdom. So I said, I'll set up for you a priesthood, I'll set up for you some idols to worship, and that became the sin and rebellion that pretty much characterized the northern kingdom of Israel until they were taken into captivity for that very thing, and along with many other things. So the calf worship is there, and that's talking about the idolatry. And he says they made kings, but not through me. They set up princesses, but I knew it not. In other words, their rulership was not ordained, was not authorized. Jeroboam went up there starting his own nation. That wasn't authorized by God. Neither was their worship. Their political system and their worship was not authorized by God. I didn't do this. This is their rebellion against me. And they made silver and gold. They made idols for their own destruction. That means simply that you engage in idolatry, you're going to destroy your own soul. You do that to your own destruction. It's like any sin or rebellion against God. It's hurting yourself. You're going to bring destruction upon yourself because you're going to have to face God's wrath. And we think about idolatry as being something way over in India and Africa. Did you know there's a Buddhist temple here in Royse City? The Blacklands, not far from here, Blackland Road. I looked it up on the internet, the exact address. I've seen it from the road. There's a Buddhist temple here in Royse City. And people go there and they engage in Buddhism. And there's a temple there with an idol in it. Just within a stone's throw of this building. So it's very close at hand as far as false religion is concerned. But then you have the more sophisticated idols that Americans come up with. Not so much an image, but what? I heard mumbling. What was that? Materialism. Materialism is probably covetousness, which is idolatry, Paul said. Colossians 3, he said materialism, which is covetousness, is idolatry. So not only do you have that Buddhist temple, which is idolatry, but every time you go into the gas station and they're playing the lottery, That's idolatry. Greed. You got to sit there and wait for them to scratch the numbers and figure out what's the possible winnings of today. And, I'm sitting there with my drink that's getting warm because I got to wait for them to worship their idol. And people don't think about that as idolatry. And a lot of brethren won't even speak against that. They won't touch greed or the lottery as being a form of sin. But it is, yes.
Buddhist Meditation Center or something right over here on 1138 that I passed as I come to church.
Okay, that could be. That must be something else, because the one I'm referring to is on this side of the highway, or on the south side of 30. That might be another thing. So it's all around. It's close at hand. So you have Buddhism. Literal falling down before an image. Of course, Catholicism is full of idolatry, the worship of Mary and the worship of images. Now they say it's not worship; they say it's adoration, but still worship. Only God deserves adoration. Only God deserves you to pray to Him. You got that. You got materialism. There's many aspects of materialism. Some people worship their careers. They devote themselves as a living sacrifice to their careers. And God has no place in their life, and their family has second or third place at best, because they're devoted to their careers. So there's all forms of idolatry today. Many lessons can be seen from that. We can be obsessed with something that in and of itself would not be wrong. Having a career isn't wrong. In fact, we're commanded to work with our hands. We're commanded to have a job, but we're not to put it first. We're not to put anything or anyone first in our life. Only God is to have that place. So they're worshiping the calves and such. There in verses 4 through 6, again, they got that concept from Egypt. That's exactly what Aaron came up with at the foot of Mount Sinai. He made them a golden calf to worship because they wanted to go back to Egypt, because they didn't know about Moses and understand what he was doing. So that concept, you see the influence there of idolatry, the influence of the world, of them making a calf and worshiping it. Verse 7, "For they sow the wind and shall reap the whirlwind. The standing grain has no heads, it shall yield no flour. If it were to yield, strangers would devour it." There's that famous phrase that you hear preachers use from time to time. They sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. What does that mean? Exactly. Galatians 6 and verse 8. Verse 7 and 8. "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life." You reap what you sow, and you will always reap more than you sow. That's why it says they've sown to the wind, they will reap the whirlwind. What they're doing is wrong. It's contrary to the will of God. A wind will not be that destructive. But what will happen as a result of that is a whirlwind, tornado, something dangerous that will be destructive, that would be devastating to them. So their idolatry, they're reaping what they've sown. He says they're making these idols to their own destruction. Same thing, same way of saying the same thing, just in different terms. You're sowing to the wind, you're going to reap the whirlwind. Mm-hmm. Right.
Even with the bills, they have their head, they're working hard, and they're going to get back nothing, because it's vanity. What they're putting in, the worldly things aren't worth anything.
Right. That's exactly right. They're not going to get any any lasting results or any satisfying results out of what they're doing, it's only going to result in their destruction. It was very interesting last night. Those who were at the debate, you remember this. The very good question was asked by the preacher to the atheist. When life on earth is over and when there's no more humanity and the sun is burning out, will what you have done here upon the earth matter? And the atheist came to the mic and he said, no. No. And this is an atheist who wants to help people. He's trying to set up a clinic in which he can help people get off drugs and help people get their lives cleaned up. He thinks that's a good work to do, and I'm wondering why is that good? If there's no standard, how do you know that's good? Atheists have no standard of good. That's just something he likes to do. I mean, he likes to help people. He's a benevolent atheist. And so the question was asked, well, what you do after this life, will it matter? He said no. And so it's basically just momentary, help. It has no meaning. It has no bearing. It has no future. But really, as an atheist, there is a future, and it's not good. That's the sad thing. He, like many atheists, think that they can do a lot of good, and just in case there's a God, he's going to say, look at all the good that I've done. And it doesn't work that way. It does not work that way, because without faith it's impossible to please God. So you always, when you sow, you always reap more than you sow. That's true in crops, right? You want to get back more than you've sown. You plant the seed, you want a plant or a tree to grow up that's going to produce that seed plus much more. So you always reap more than you have sown. And that's the principle there in Galatians 6 and verse 8. He who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. And that's going to be eternal punishment in hell. Like Johnny Ramsey used to preach, he used to say, people live in the flesh and they sow to the flesh and then they pray for a crop failure. But there's not going to be a crop failure. It's going to happen. You're going to reap what you sow. Yes, sir.
I was thinking about some of the things that he said last night too, and it brings me to the point of when Christ returns that one day this fellow is going to have to bow down to Jesus Christ and recognize Him. The Bible said, "Every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess."
That's right. That's right. He will become a believer someday, but then it will not benefit him. It's only now when it benefits you to become a believer and become submissive to Him. But the statement is true. There will be no atheist in hell. They will all be believers by then. But they will be punished for eternity for their rebellion. It is a sin in and of itself to be an atheist, to say there is no God and to not submit to Christ. But you're exactly right. He's going to someday submit to Him. He's going to be forced to. Now he has the choice. But one day, every knee will bow. He's going to be forced to. And then it will be too late. And so I hope his mind changes and his heart changes before that happens. Verse 8 of Hosea 8 and verse 8. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. They have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has hired lovers. Though they hire allies among the nations, I will soon gather them up, and the king and the princes shall soon writhe because of the tribute. So they're saying they're going among the nations. You're already among the nations in the sense of that's where you're looking for your help. That's what you want to be like. And you're being like the nations. He's saying, okay, I'll bring in a nation in to conquer you. You want to be like the nations? I'll bring a nation down. Assyria, 722 BC, will conquer you and absorb you, if that's what you want. You're going up to Assyria, a wild donkey wandering alone, and Ephraim has hired lovers. And it says they hire allies among the nations. And he says, I will gather them up, and the king of the princes shall soon writhe because of their tribute. They're paying tribute to these other nations. Again, that was against the will of God. You don't make alliances with the nations around about you. You don't intermarry with them. And a lot of those marriages that took place were political marriages. There were alliances. That's why the king would have all kinds of wives and concubines. I think it was 700 wives, 700 wives and 300 concubines Solomon had. And a lot of them were political alliances. And he would bring them over from the neighboring nation, and then they get homesick. They want to worship their God. So they built a tribute to their God. He built a tribute to them, and Solomon was responsible for introducing idolatry into Israel because he violated the will of God by intermarrying with the world. And notice what it says there in verse 8. Israel is swallowed up. Already they are among the nations as a useless vessel. Useless vessel. And he said before, you're like a silly dove. He's called them in times past other things. He says you're like a prostitute. Now he says you're like a useless vessel. A vessel is only useful for when you use it for the purpose for which it's made. Israel was made as a vessel, so to speak, to glorify God and to be a containment for all the blessings that would be for the rest of the world through Christ. And they're useless. When people become wicked and become like the world, what good is a Christian that acts just like an atheist? What good is that? And you know, he did, again, those that were at the debate, you remember the question that the atheist asked, why is the divorce rate among those who believe in God almost the same as those who don't? And that was a very good question. And I think the preacher answered it very well. He said, well, people just don't follow the Bible like they should. I mean, that's really it. They don't follow the Bible. And so here's an atheist looking from the outside in and seeing that a lot of people who claim to believe in God are living as though there is no God and as though God hadn't spoken on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So again, the concept of being like the nations that are around about you. Verses 11 through 14, we'll stop at verse 14. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, they have become to him altars for sinning. Verse 12, were I to write for him my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. As for my sacrificial offerings, they sacrifice meat and eat it, but the Lord does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his Maker and has built places, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. So I will send a fire upon these cities, and I shall devour her strongholds. So again, we see here that God through Hosea is saying to them, you've multiplied your altars for sinning. They have become to him altars for sinning. These were religious altars, but God isn't accepting what they're doing. He says it's sinning, it's rebellion against God because of their idolatry and their morality is not in harmony with God's will. Verse 12 is very interesting. Were I to write for them my laws by the 10,000s, they would be regarded as a strange thing. You know, the whole concept of just spelling it all out for you, if I just wrote it by the 10,000s, just spelled it all out, it'd still be strange to you. And, you know, people have problems enough with the plain teaching of the Bible. And they want something plainly said in the Bible. They want a plain statement in the Bible about a certain thing, but the other plain statements they don't do. There's other plain statements that they disregard. So if it was all spelled out for them, they still would think it was a strange thing. And see, they're still very religious. Verse 13, my sacrifice offerings, they sacrifice meat on it, meat and eat it rather, but the Lord does not accept them. Even though they're sacrificing, and even though they're worshiping idolatry, they're still, some of them, worshiping God with the idols. He says, I'm not going to accept that. God never accepts a divided allegiance. Jesus said you cannot serve two masters. It's chapter 7 and verse 14. Right.
They're going through the motions.
Right.
They're doing it, but it's not from their heart. It's just, okay, we're doing it. And again, they may not even know why they're doing it. We're doing the sacrifices. We were told to do them, we're going to do them.
Right.
But it's not from their heart.
Exactly. It's mechanical. It's habit, not conviction, so to speak.
A lot of people sitting in the pews.
Exactly. It's the thing to do. Yes. Denominations, exactly.
They think that what they're being taught is the Bible, and it's not.
Right. Exactly right. And with those who are willing to study for themselves, they'll see it. But with those who are not, they're satisfied with what they're doing. And they're like verse 14. They forget God. They have forgotten their Maker, and they've built palaces and such. And later on in chapter 9, he's going to talk about their palaces and things of that nature. Yes.
A couple of things as I'm looking at this. I'm thinking about how man's cycle of behavior continues on through in the New Testament, thinking about Revelation, and how Christ ended up having to rebuke many of the churches that were, these people at that time of being part of the New Covenant. And this is, God's having to rebuke Israel right now. They are dying inside. They aren't doing as they were supposed to do, just like the churches in Asia, some of the churches anyway, in Asia. And God had to rebuke them at that time. A second thing, as I'm looking at this, one lesson that I feel I can learn personally is to not be complacent. It seemed like as soon as Israel got into the promised land, then they got comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And they felt like they didn't need God anymore. And I think that it's a dangerous thing for us as well if we as Christians don't strive to put challenges before ourselves, contributing to this church directly through doing helping us to grow, helping make the facilities better, helping to edify one another, and so personally challenging ourselves, we become complacent and we end up just dying in the community, or not. I'll say some of these things that we've already mentioned about the Buddhism, whatever else is going on here in Royse City, we're on our own little island.
Right.
And we become complacent because, that's just the way, I guess, we are as human beings.
I think you're right. We just keep house, just kind of, long as Buddhism doesn't walk through the door, we're fine. But we have to have an attitude of this is affecting our community, and it's going to affect people, and people are going to lose their souls over this. And we have to continue to fight against it. I think you're right about the whole complacency attitude. They got in the land, they got comfortable, and they let their guard down.
Judah would, in verse 14, would not have had to multiply the fortified cities
Exactly.
had they not gone out and done what they needed to do.
Exactly. That's a good point. And one last thing about verse 14 that kind of, when I was studying this, kind of brought to my mind. It says, Israel has forgotten his Maker and built palaces. And I was thinking about churches that forget the Lord and they build palaces. Big, fancy buildings. So big they got to be called campuses now. Churches have forgotten the Lord, they've forgotten their Maker, and now they build palaces. Nothing wrong with a nice building. In fact, you can have the combination of a sound church in a nice building. That's rare, though. Because so often, the nice building becomes the focal point, and paying for that nice building becomes the motivation and everything, as Johnny Ramsey used to say, becomes a church house religion. Everything orbits around the building and how beautiful it is. And that's what you find here in verse 14. Israel has forgotten his Maker and built palaces. I think that you could say that about churches of Christ. A lot of them has forgotten the Lord, and they build palaces for themselves. And the emphasis is on themselves, especially when the buildings are to almost glorify themselves, and plus the facilities are not to do the Lord's work, but to entertain. We got to have a family life center. We got to have this gymnasium to entertain all the people. We got to get. That's how we'll get people in. We got to have the family life center and the gymnasium and all the things that go along with that, and the thousands and even millions of dollars that goes into that, and forgot who they are, the Lord's people doing the Lord's work. And I think that's like Israel of old. They forgot their Maker and they started building for themselves palaces. Be reading Hosea chapter 9, and we will go into Hosea 9 next week, Lord willing.